This week's episode of our show is sponsored by the Ethereal Expanse Kickstarter, the latest project from Ghostfire Gaming.
If you like swashbuckling high fantasy settings, then get ready to set your sails into the mystical seas of the astral plane.
This 5th edition compatible sourcebook details the fantastic world set on a sea of starlight floating in the astral plane, and is a wonderful mashup of naval pirate adventures with a really out there wild high fantasy feel. Best of all, the campaign is available with a wide range of physical and digital accessories, so you can use the VTT of your choice from Foundry to Roll20, or you can play in person with the awesome GM screen and other accessories included in the Kickstarter.
The Ethereal Expanse includes a wide range of factions and empires for your characters to either join or oppose. So if you're interested in exploring the Ethereal Expanse, make sure to jump in on the Kickstarter by following the links below, and definitely check out the incredible trailer there as well. And now, on to this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin,
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Today, we are tier ranking the multi-classing combinations that you can make with monks in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Monks are a pretty divisive class in D&D. Some people love them, some people hate them, some people love to hate them. Generally speaking, though, the monks are a pretty versatile class with a very unique skill set. So how do they combine with the other classes in D&D? If you want to see how we are ranking the multi-class combinations, you can check out our video where we go over our ranking system right up over there. But in general, we're looking at combinations of 2 classes, and for the purposes of this video, Monk is going to be the majority of the classes for the sweet spots of D&D. It's kind of our bread and butter, and then we might be dipping or grabbing a few levels of the other classes.
Monks are a dexterity and wisdom based class that actually have a lot of restrictions on what they can do and what types of weapons and armor they're allowed to combine with their abilities like Flurry of Blows, using their key points, using monk weapons, and their general martial arts vibe. So when we're going through the multi-classing combinations, one thing that we're always going to have to take a look at is, does this actually work with the monk features as written? It's going to be a recurring theme that comes up time and time again in this episode. And sometimes we might be recommending that you break the rules a little bit so that these combos can work. That, plus some of our own biases, mean that we have our opinions as always, and so we've polled our community to find out what their rankings are as well. We'll have those up at the end of the video too. And for the most part, we are going to be looking at the overall combat potency of how the multi-class combinations work for the monk, but we will also be considering their non-combat functionality and utility functionality. In general, I kind of believe that almost any spellcasting multi-class is actually going to give the monk more non-combat utility exploration options, because basically all their utility is baked into their skills. But we'll see how that goes along as we go through the rankings.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling. So kicking things off with the Artificer, and right away, there's a theme that I'm going to be bringing to this episode.
Okay.
Artificer Monk. If we played a turtle Artificer Monk, who are we? We're Donatello.
We are Donatello.
Donatello is the turtle Artificer Monk. At least in the more modern rendition of Donatello. I think in the early days, all the Ninja Turtles were kind of samey, but their personalities came out more and more, and Donatello's the inventor.
Totally. As much as I love Donatello as a character, I actually find it very difficult to say which of my Ninja Turtles is the favorite.
Donatello's my favorite, hands down.
Okay. Fair. I really think that the Artificer Monk combination has a lot of problems.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, many of the Artificer subclasses pull you towards using weapons, armor, or spellcasting, and the Artificer is an intelligence-based spellcaster. And intelligence is typically a dump stat for monks. So in order to even multiclass into this, we need to put a 13 in intelligence. This really makes the point buy ability scores hard to balance out off the bat. And with the slow buildup of Artificer spellcasting when we're multiclassing, we really don't get a lot of amazing features off the bat. We're also going to be a couple levels behind where our infusions and spell levels should be on the Artificer side. And on the Monk side, probably, in most cases, I feel, with the Monk, you really want to get those first 5 or 6 levels under your belt because you want to get extra attack. You want to get a good number of key points built up so that you can regularly use Flurry of Blows. And you also want to get access to Stunning Strike, the key Empowered Strikes, and your 6th level subclass feature. I don't think you'd ever want to jump into Artificer before you had those levels under your belt as a Monk. And many of the Artificer subclasses are just fully incompatible. The armor just simply doesn't work because you have to be wearing armor of some kind for the majority of the features.
Beyond the armor, if we look at our other options for the Artificer, we have the Battlesmith, which at first I was like, maybe this one will work. But in order to command your Steel Defender, you're using your bonus actions, which now interferes with your ability to use Flurry of Blows and so many of the amazing Monk features. Mm-hmm. Basically, the bread and butter of what makes the Monk amazing is using your bonus action to do cool stuff.
Yeah.
So, Battlesmith, not going to work. Artillerist, maybe?
Again, Artillerist, you got to use bonus actions here as
Right.
well. It wants to be a ranged attacker as well. It really wants to have its intelligence high because it's focused on spell casting, not going into melee. So this leaves us with
The
Alchemist, which, cool. Way of Mercy Alchemist?
Way of Mercy Alchemist feels like your battle medic.
This could be cool, but there's thematic synergy there. I just don't think that it really plays well together. I think that I think this is D tier.
I agree, it's D tier. Sorry, Donatello. D for Donatello. My favorite Ninja Turtle. I think if I was building you in D&D, you would just be an artificer, a turtle artificer named Donatello.
Yeah.
I would just skip the monk, which feels weird to make a Ninja Turtle that doesn't have part monk in it, but...
But you could be an armorer, although that would be weird with the turtle features. But you could then say your armor unarmed strikes. Like,
Yeah.
you could flavor it.
We can
find a
flavor
way.
it.
You could find a way.
So D tier, sorry Donnie. Moving on though to
The angriest Ninja Turtle, Raphael.
Raphael, the
Barbarian.
Barbarian. And
Exactly.
I do think that you can build Raphael here.
Yes, in particular, this comes from our good friend Colby over at D4 Deep Dive. In response to our Barbarian Monk speculation, actually built that character up. And so you should check out his full video there because he has a lot of points on the challenges of making this build work. What Colby presented in that episode is that you just ignore dexterity. You get the minimum for the multiclassing and you be a strength-based monk as a barbarian. The reason why you do this is that none of the monk features require you to attack with dexterity.
They give you the option to.
But they don't require it. Whereas the barbarian features, the rage, bonus damage, and reckless attack require you to be using strength. So we ignore our dexterity and we build up our strength and our wisdom, and it actually ends up working out and doing a fair amount of damage with a lot of extra attacks.
There is one problem, though, that Colby does solve in an interesting way, but I want to point out that it is a limitation that both your barbarian and your monk want to have enough dexterity to give you a good AC, and actually both options struggle with AC sometimes.
Yeah.
Colby solves this by picking the turtle, which makes it even more Raphael.
Because again, you can't combine. Being a barbarian monk doesn't let you make your AC, your dexterity, plus your wisdom, plus your constitution. It's either or. You can't have both combined together.
Yeah, so you're struggling with your AC here, and Colby solves that by a turtle automatically gets 17 AC.
Yeah.
But if you're not playing a turtle, that's not enough for me to
why are
say.
you even playing a monk? Like, isn't that the whole appeal, to be a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle?
I mean, yeah, but no. No, you want to be Shredder.
Okay. Colby, here's my answer for you. I think that your build depends on the build and makes the Barbarian Monk a B tier. I think what Colby built is A+. I think it's really, really strong. But I think that if you're trying to go outside of that, you very quickly become locked into the main components of what Colby presented there of you have to be strength-based, you should probably play a turtle, and it means that the options there are super, super limited. And I think that otherwise, like on paper, if you're not trying to solve that limitation, it would otherwise be D tier in a lot of cases.
Yeah. If you want to check out Colby's build, we're going to pop up the video right there. But he's the exception to the rule. And I think Colby's having a lot of fun being the exception to the rule.
Yes.
But one build, thank you, Colby, is not enough to make the entire multi-class option great as a whole. No matter what we say or give a D tier to, somebody's going to be like, but what if you do this very specific thing? And the answer is like, yeah, probably. The one specific thing. I still think that you actually do run into a lot of roadblocks with the Barbarian Monk. Mm-hmm. There are options here, though. Yeah. So I think B.
And even though those roadblocks can be solved, the presence of those roadblocks make the ranking worse. We have to factor those into the ranking, right? So, moving along to the Bard.
The Bard, okay. If we got Donatello is the Artificer, Raphael's the Barbarian, Michelangelo's the Bard.
Totally. Completely agree. And take the chef feat so you're serving up the pizza.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not going to be a very effective character, though, I don't think, because, again, we run into a bunch of issues. We have to put a 13 in our charisma, and, again, monks typically want to dump that charisma score, and bards typically don't need to have their wisdom score very high themselves, so you end up with that mental ability score issue. Both classes don't mind having a good dexterity score, but ultimately, where do we go with the bard levels? Well, we can add some spells, we can get some utility out of those spell casting, but in looking at the bard spell list, nothing strikes me as something that it's going to immediately help us in combat. And because we have the ability scores to juggle, we either have to make a choice. Do we want to have accurate attacks? Do we want to have a good spell saving throw DC? Or do we want to have a good stunning strike DC? So it's not really possible to make the character effective on all three fronts at the same time, because you have these three ability scores that you have to divide your attention between. So we could mostly pick up the bard spells that don't rely on the saving throw DC.
Yeah.
But that's a pretty
like
slim
supports, buff, that sort of stuff. But I do, like, when I think of this combo, the first thing that pops into my head that does sound appealing at a first thought is the Whispers Bard combined with the Shadow Monk. Cool conceptually, but I still don't think you're getting enough out of any. Like, the Bard loves charisma. And as soon as with the monk, because we're looking at dexterity, wisdom, and no matter what you want, a good con, as soon as you add a fourth option in, it becomes troublesome.
Exactly. And it's worth pointing out that if you have to have a non-synergistic stat in the point buy array, right, getting a 13 in every stat, including Constitution, is already 20 out of your 27 points. Right? Because if we have to have 13 dex, 13 charisma, 13 wisdom, and we want at least a 14 con. So at this point, the best we can do is we can buy ourselves up to we can with the remaining points buy ourselves a 15 dexterity and a 14 con. We end up with a +1 wisdom, +1 charisma, which means that our DCs for stunning strike and any bard spells we take are not going to be very good.
And nothing sucks more than blowing all of your key points on stunning strikes that never land.
Yeah.
I know that for a fact, so...
Yeah. And while we could combine things with the Swords Bard or the Valor Bard to cast and attack at the same time, or use the Blade Flourishes, again, the number of uses of your Bardic Inspiration is dependent on your Charisma modifier, and you have to take several levels of Bard before those come back on a short rest. Before then, it's a long rest. So, multi-classing into the Bard, I just think we end up diluting things too much.
Is this a D tier?
Yeah.
Sorry, Mikey. Mikey and Donnie.
Sorry, guys. Leonardo's going to have to wait, because we're moving on to the Cleric.
Yeah.
And here's where I think we're starting to cook with gas. Because the only thing the Cleric asks of us is a 13 in Wisdom to multiclass into, which we need to multiclass out of Monk anyways. So it's very easy for us to just do a very standard ability score array. Once we add in the boost from our Ancestry, we can end up with a 16 or even higher Dexterity, a good Con score, and a really high Wisdom, which means we're going to have good spell saving throw DCs and good DCs as well. So the combo of Cleric and Monk, already the ability score problem does not exist here.
I do think that it's interesting that you do run into a little bit of a problem, but it's not enough to ruin anything here, where spellcasting doesn't allow you to use your martial arts.
Mm-hmm.
But a cleric has a lot of spells that either remain on the battlefield, buff parties, you can do things before battle, outside of combat.
Yep.
There's a lot of helpful spells that if you're picking and choosing the right ones, Aid, great. Hero's Feast, great. There's ones that you can use to bolster the whole party. Meanwhile, there's our two favorite cleric spells, Spiritual Weapon and Spirit Guardians. Spiritual Weapon might sound cool, but it does use your bonus action. So you're not going to be using your amazing martial arts features there. But Spirit Guardians, once it's active, it's just going. And if you have Stunning Strike and you knock a person out and they just keep taking damage from your Spirit Guardians, that's beautiful.
Yeah, that is a really effective thing to do, and it really boosts the monk's damage up, and it's all working together based on our wisdom. We could even probably go further and get Magic Initiate to get Shillelagh, and then our quarterstaff attacks can use our wisdom, so there could be a way to make this single ability score dependent if we wanted to. That's optional, I think. I think it's fine. There are many clerics that I've seen in play that are dexterity wisdom split, and that is totally workable. We don't have to wear armor. Our unarmored defense will still be quite good, and we can avail ourselves of the wide range of cleric domains and get interesting powers. We could be a death domain cleric to get that extra bonus damage. We could be twilight domain. We could be peace domain. Any domain you want to go with is going to work well with what you're doing on the monk. It's going to give you more spells to use from. It's going to give you those domain powers, and in a lot of cases, something very powerful that you can use to augment your already existing abilities.
I feel like there's a thematic through line with the peace cleric and the mercy monk.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think that Shadow and Twilight work really, really nicely together.
Yeah.
If you wanted to be a Way of the Long Death monk and a Death Domain cleric, sure, go ahead. I could see a lot of these combos work really, really well. And so thematically, the links are really, really strong. Life of Contemplation, you can really amp up the religious element and the monastic sort of thing. You could draw inspiration from whatever sort of real world cultures you wanted to adapt that. And I think you've got something that sings really well conceptually here. I think this is probably both conceptually and mechanically the S tier option. And I think that a Monk 6, Cleric 5 is probably stronger than a level 11 Monk.
I think that something is interesting when you say that. I was going to give this an A, but I'm trying to think of anything else that might be an S here. But really, when you think about it, Monk up to level 6, you get a lot of amazing features, including upgrading your martial arts die. Your martial arts die, though, doesn't upgrade again until level 11.
Yeah, the martial arts die is at a D6 until level 11, and then it goes to a D8, and then it stays there until level 17 when it becomes a D10.
Having played a monk all the way up to level 17, one thing that I'm realizing right now is one reason why I think we rag on the monk a lot is there's that sweet spot of D&D,
yeah,
which is levels like 5 to 10.
Yeah.
As a monk, you get all your cool stuff early. Between levels 5 and 10, we could argue that there's some neat abilities there, but there's a lot of
Nothing is increasing your damage. You're getting evasion, which is a great feature, but it's nothing to write home about. You're getting the boosts to your movement speed, but you already got a lot of those boosts. So I really do think that overall, if you're expecting your campaign to only go to level 11, 12, 13, I think that it's stronger. And even then, there's a very strong case to be made that loss of going from a D6 to a D10, it seems like a lot, but on average, that's only 2 extra points of damage per attack. Now the monks are making 4 attacks, so that does add up to 8 extra damage. But you know what is definitely going to do more than 8 damage in a single round? Spirit Guardians.
I was going to give this an A, but I think I'm going to give it an S as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think unequivocally, just having something to concentrate on is almost always going to improve your monk's damage. And so even the ones that we're going to talk about, a lot of other spellcasters, and even though we gave the Bard a D ranking, the Bard spell list isn't giving you the clear-cut, oh, here's your damage dealing option with it.
And it might give you some utility outside of combat, which we do want to take into account as well. But so does the Cleric, and the Cleric's also bolstering some of the elements of being a monk.
And the Cleric isn't asking you to take a stat that would normally be your dump stat.
And I think, okay, so S tier for Cleric, but I think as we move on to the Druid, we're also looking at a wisdom-based spellcaster.
Yeah, so it's easy for us to multiclass into this. The Druid does not have the clear-cut slam dunk spell that Spirit Guardians is.
I do have a few ideas, though, for the Druid.
Okay.
So with the Druid, some interesting things to consider is you do get access to something like Shillelagh.
Yep.
Which, with your quarterstaff, works great. So you can now be whipping people with your staff for good damage. So that's kind of...
What Shillelagh does is it doesn't really improve your damage so much as it lets you have your wisdom the higher stat.
Which, as a monk, isn't the worst thing. We could do that. But then also, you could concentrate on Moonbeam.
Yep.
The one downside here, though, is that as a druid, Wild Shape, at first glance, I was like, ooh, could I Wild Shape into a bear and Flurry of Blows? But bears use claw and bite attacks as natural weapons. They do not make unarmed strikes.
It is subject to a little bit of interpretation. Some DMs might rule that this doesn't work. Some rule that it does. But if, again, Kung Fu Panda, I want to be Kung Fu Panda, that would be super cool. One thing that I will point out with the Druid Monk combo is the open hand technique, which gives us a push on our Flurry of Blows attacks. And what the Druid spell list does give us in spades, Moonbeam sets up a damaging area. Druids have Wall of Fire. They've got a lot of damaging area spells that you can then punch, kick, prone, stun, leave your enemy burning in. And again, all those spells are going to have good saving throw DCs because the wisdom is not fighting for an ability score. Again, that's for the other spellcasters that are int or charisma based, we're not able to have this nice focus of a good stunning strike DC and a good spell saving throw DC at the same time.
Yeah.
Right?
There is one other build that I do want to talk about here, though. The Spores Druid.
Yes.
So the Spores Druid lets you have your Halo of Spores, adding an additional D6 of necrotic damage to your attacks while you have your temporary hit points.
Just turn all of our unarmed strikes from a D6
into
short
2d6.
sword, basically 4 greatsword attacks.
Yeah.
It's like now every use of Flurry of Blows is like we're action surging as a fighter.
The downside, which I do have a solution for, the downside is that once your temporary hit points are gone, you lose that extra D6.
Yeah.
And as a monk, if you're running in there and getting punched once, you might lose, because we're only taking like 2 levels of Druid, we're only going to have 8 temporary hit points.
I don't think we need to take 2 levels of Druid. I think we could actually do 6 levels of Monk, and we could do 5 levels of Druid. And then
Fair.
we're going to have 20 temporary hit points, which, again, if you get hit at that level, you might lose them. But I think it's pretty okay.
Also, my solution is, as a monk player, I think that it's almost necessary to take the mobile feat. Your job is not to be a frontliner. Your job is to get into where the frontliners are, clean up the mess, and get out.
Yeah.
I was notorious for stealing everybody else's kills when I was a monk because they would be fighting. I would run in, kill, run to the next person, kill, and then run back.
Yeah.
But if you have the mobile feat or some way of leaving combat, your temporary hit points will last longer until the DM realizes what's going on and focuses on you, but you have a much better chance of getting in, doing this massive amount of damage, and getting out.
This is really good too.
I think, again, we run into a couple roadblocks.
Yeah.
The Spores Druid, there's a build here. You should take mobile. You should take a few levels of Spores Druid.
I think it's flat out stronger than than going to level 11 with the monk.
I think it's an A.
It's A plus for me for sure. I think the cleric is, if we put the druid in the S tier, I think that the cleric is still a bit stronger than it, but it's really, really strong. I'm hesitant to not put it in S tier.
So it's funny, I gave it an A, but if I was playing one of these, I would probably play the Spores Druid.
The Spores build is really strong, and
like Shadow Spore.
Yeah, I think though the Spirit Guardians one is just way more reliable, because if all of your attacks hit with Flurry of Blows, it's 4d6 extra damage on one target. But that Cleric with Spirit Guardians,
it's more consistent.
It's more consistent because it could hit a variety of enemies, and I think stunning people in there, I think you get a lot more out of it overall. So I think the Druid is A+.
All right.
Yeah. Okay, moving along to the fighter.
Leonardo.
Here's Leonardo. I agree. 2-level fighter dip for Action Surge, Second Wind, and a fighting style.
If you really want to make Leonardo, take Inspiring Leader as well.
Be a Tensei, so you can use a longsword as a monk weapon.
Yeah.
Right, count that as your katana. Take the dueling style, get that +2 damage. I think you got it at that point. And I think all you need is 2 levels of fighter, and that's kind of it.
I do think that this is viable. So out of all the Ninja Turtles, Raphael and Leonardo, viable builds. Michelangelo and Donatello are less viable builds.
You could go the 3rd level with the fighter, grab Battlemaster. Having Battlemaster maneuvers on top of being an open hand monk or whatever monk subclass you are, makes you feel like, oh, those key points that I lost, I just got these they're not key points, but they're still points that I can use for something else.
You have 2 pools of points that you can use for various abilities, and that feels good. I do like Action Surge on a monk is just wild.
Yeah.
And now I'm starting to imagine, again, I know we don't do this in this video, but I'm starting to imagine, what if there was a fighter Spores Druid monk that could Action Surge with 2d6 on their 4 attacks.
Or you're the Cleric monk fighter and Action Surging to get Spirit Guardians down. Because Spirit Guardians is still an action to cast.
Fighter feels really good here. I mean, it's hard to deny that Action Surge on any character that's doing multiple attacks.
It is. And this is definitely dip territory. I think that maybe you're going to take 3 levels of fighter. I don't know where you're going to go from there. But Monk 6, Fighter 3, I think looks really good at level 9.
I think that's A material.
It totally is. I just don't... I would even, at that point, I would multiclass a 3rd time.
Might be an option for our 3 multiclass video.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think Fighter's A. We move on to the Paladin. You could argue that maybe Leonardo's a Paladin as well. At first glance, I thought that this was going to work. I thought maybe there's like some smites that we can add in there. But there's one complication with the Paladin Monk build that I think ruins the entire thing. And that is that Paladins are already the most ability-stretched class in the game. You want Charisma, you want Constitution, you want Strength. Then for a Monk, you want Wisdom, and you want Dexterity.
Yeah.
So at this point, we're either lowering our Constitution. I mean, we're dumping Intelligence, obviously, but we're still stretched so thin that I don't think it's worth it.
It's pretty tough because the multiclassing requires that we have 13 Strength, 13 Dexterity, 13 Wisdom, and 13 Charisma. So that means if we're playing point buy, 20 out of our 27 points are simply spent meeting the prerequisites. We don't have to put any more points into Intelligence.
We absolutely need to put 4 points into Con to get a positive modifier. There's no way that you want to go into a D&D game with negative Constitution.
But that only leaves us with 3 points left. And there's not really much that we can do with those 3 points. We can move one of the other 13s to a 14, which means that even if we get a +2 from our ancestry, we're only going to be starting play with 16 dexterity, and we're only going to have a +1 wisdom modifier. We can't, that hanging leftover point, you might as well put that in con, because it costs 2 points to buy a 14 from a 13. So we end up with 13s in everything and a 14 dexterity and an 8 intelligence. So now we don't have a good charisma score to get good paladin features. We don't have a good wisdom score for any of our other functions. We have the strength score, which is probably doing nothing for us. So right off the bat with the ability scores, I think it's a complete non-starter.
I think that unfortunately, despite the synergy you might be able to find within abilities, if there is any, I can't look past this launch pad. And it's a fail to launch, and I think it's D tier.
Yeah, we're just not even going to get out the door because none of the features that we would want to combine are going to have the bonuses high enough to make those worth using.
Yeah,
and I think that this is the ability score problem is one of the biggest things that isn't considered, that maybe is the make or break for most of these multi-class combos.
Yeah.
Because we can talk about the abstractions of, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if we had this character that had 20 dexterity, 20 strength, 20 wisdom, and 20 charisma? Yeah, that would be awesome. But in reality, we're never going to get that.
On the flip side, though, we come to the Ranger.
Who, the Ranger and the Monk, both require 13 wisdom and dexterity to multiclass. So it's perfect synergy on the flip side.
Perfect synergy. And like the fighter, we are gaining a fighting style.
Yep.
We are also gaining some spell casting. And mainly, when you think of a ranger, what's a ranger's go-to spell?
Hunter's Mark, which is adding d6 to every damage. Sure, we have to spend that additional bonus action to put it down. That's always been a obstacle for rangers anyways. But now we're getting exactly what we were getting from that Spores Druid benefit. I mean, technically, you could also take the 2 levels of Druid.
Okay, wait, hold on. What if I'm a ranger, a Gloomstalker ranger,
Shadow Monk,
Spores Druid with 2 levels of fighter.
This is like some Dark Elf Underdark territory here.
I can action surge to lay down 8 3d6 attacks.
That's good.
That's a 4 multi-class combo. We're breaking the mold here, but I just needed to say that out loud. I want to build that. Colby, build it. Colby, let's work together and do a video.
Can you get 3 levels? Can you get like 5 levels of Cleric in there too and have Spirit Guardians at the same time?
Oh, man.
No, you can't because Spirit Guardians and Hunter's Mark are concentration.
Fair.
But
the Ranger, the Gloomstalker Shadow is great. Just even if we're going with the 2 of them. The Shadow Monk, Gloomstalker Ranger, brilliant.
Awesome synergy. It's really going to amp up your skills too. It's really going to increase your ability to use stealth, to acrobatics, stealth. The skill synergy is really there. The ranger spells are going to add a lot of utility without asking too much. You get just a little bit in those first couple levels. Really does a lot for you. Monk 6, Gloomstalker Ranger 5. Looks beautiful.
You know, this might be overkill, but if you're also thinking about it, some other spells that pop up for Ranger for me. Monks love being maneuverable. Add Zephyr Strike onto there.
Ooh. Or we could be a Kensai with a longbow.
Yes.
And an Archer Monk Ranger. That could work. Could it work? Does it work?
I feel like thematically as well, like monks and rangers at first glance you might think are opposing, but like if
you're one with nature.
Yeah, one with nature, which is somewhat druidic, but monks could be that one with nature, the land, the
I
holy
do like
land.
it as the bridge though to the druid, and I like the idea of moving the Spores Druid in there too.
I mean, there's a great build here for a multi combo, but we can talk about that. Maybe we should do a whole video about that build.
Yeah, I think both of these work really well.
I think this is A+. S?
I don't know. It's definitely A+. I think it's I still feel the Cleric is stronger. I think that it's really... But you know what? In fairness, the Cleric takes till level 11 for Spirit Guardians to come online. But I think the Druid and the Ranger, you're getting those big damage boosts within the first 2 levels of that class.
I'm giving this one my S. This is my S.
Yeah.
I think the Ranger Monk actually... The synergy just works so well. And I can see so many Ranger spells that actually work with what you want to do as a monk. No, I can't Stunning Strike a person in my Spirit Guardians. But I can Stunning Strike them in... something else.
It's just handy to be able to Stunning Strike them and then punch them and stab them much more.
Now, if you are an archer, you're kind of you can't Stunning Strike as much.
No, but it's still pretty strong, and I think you'd actually probably feel more like the dual wielding ranger than you want to be with this combo.
Yeah.
Another one that's really strong though, the rogue monk is really good. Again, the ability scores line up perfectly. The rogue only asks us to have a dexterity, which we're going to have anyways, so we don't need to change anything about our ability scores. The rogue is I actually think that you would use cunning action on any turn where you need to close the distance, because cunning actions is actually better than step of the wind in many cases. And you've also got sneak attack, which is a meaningful damage boost.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're thinking about it like this, sneak attack is 3d6 extra damage. And that is going to be applied on one of the attacks that we make. We have to make sure that we're still using a finesse weapon, because we can't sneak attack with a quarterstaff because it's still not a finesse weapon.
So we do have to use a short sword.
We do have to use a short sword.
And we also can't sneak attack on our flurry of blows.
No.
So we need to land one of the first 2 attacks that's still 100% increase over what the rogue usually gets.
Yes, and here's the interesting thing. If we're 5 levels of rogue, it's an extra 3d6 sneak attack damage. I generally think that with the 4 monk attacks, you're probably going to miss at least once. And the other thing that I would point out is that you still have to spend a key point for flurry of blows. So let's compare this to the Druid. The Druid had to use an action to get into the stance, into the Spores Druid thing, which falls off if they take a hit. Then it added 1d6 extra necrotic damage to each of their attacks, which if they hit with all 4 attacks, that's an extra 4d6 damage. But they had to use a limited use ability to get there. They also had to spend a key point to get the 4 attacks. Whereas the rogue is getting 3d6 extra damage with no additional resource expenditure aside from having to get advantage or flanking on their attack. And if they're not spending their key points on martial, they can actually spend their key points on stunning strike instead, and not on flurry of blows. So the rogue is less resource intensive on those few key points that you have, and it requires less setup. The rogue doesn't require us to use a bonus action for Hunter's Mark either.
I also think that, again, here, the Shadow Monk stands out as the prime option. Shadow Monk Assassin. Shadow Monk Arcane Trickster.
Yes. Both of these are good. The Familiar either floating around to enable your advantage, or the Assassination turn is really good. And again, Shadow Monk brings that little bit of extra spell casting into the mix that we need to really amp things up. You're going to feel like you can absolutely get that surprise.
Shadow Monk gives you Pass Without Trace on a rogue.
You know what? I think the rogue is way better than the ranger.
I'll give it an S as well. I'm going to give them both S. I think they're the 2 strongest combos.
I'm changing my mind too. I think the Cleric... I'm going to downgrade the Cleric to an A now that I'm thinking about this more fully. Because the Cleric becomes S when Spirit Guardian happens.
And that's not till late.
That's late.
I
think the Cleric and the Druid are A for me now. I think the Ranger and the Rogue are S. And I think the Rogue is actually way stronger. Because the resource balance is better. Don't you think?
I really like the Ranger Monk, but I might be biased.
Yeah.
I might have some bias in there somewhere.
I think they're both really good.
I do think they're both really good, and I am willing to agree. For those of you paying attention, ignore what you saw on the screen during Cleric. It's actually an A. Cleric.
Yeah,
Cleric
I think
A.
having now discussed it, I think we have to downgrade the Cleric to an A.
Ranger Rogue S.
I agree with that.
Sorcerer, on the other hand.
So again, we suffer the charisma problem here once more. Monks really don't care for their charisma, and so we have the ability score problem, not as bad as the Paladin, but it's still there like with the Bard. Having more spells on your monk is always great, and I think that the Sorcerer spell list has a lot more options for damage.
They also have things like Shield, which is very useful. But every time you cast a spell, you're not using your martial arts.
We could be quickening spells, but we're going to blow through our sorcery points.
If you're quickening spells, then you're also not going to be using Flurry of Blows.
I think the biggest issue, it really is that fundamental problem of like having the complementary, of having your stats in the right place. Because again, we already are in the place where we want to have our stats sorted properly. Here we need dexterity, wisdom, charisma, constitution. We're not going to be able to have all of these as high as we want them to be, right? And so there's a lot of cool things that you could do in theory with the Sorcerer, but your spell saving throw DC and your key strike DC are going to be so much lower that when you compare them to the Bard, when you compare the Bard, the Sorcerer, the Warlock, and the Wizard, and the Artificer to a lesser extent, to what you get out of the Cleric and the Druid, where the Wisdom lines up, it makes a big difference.
I think it does, and could I play around with meta magic? Could I play around with what spells to pick? Absolutely, but I just, in the grand scheme of things, if I'm playing a monk and I multiclass into sorcerer, I think I'm actually losing out.
Ironically, I think that monk 6, sorcerer 5 still actually might be stronger than monk 11.
I don't know.
Well, I'm still going to give it a D. In the scheme of multiclass rankings, it's still a D. But it still might actually be stronger than Monk 11.
Those middle levels of Monk just
really are bad.
They should have given them some
this
like what you get an ability that's like you don't get sick
because
like,
okay, let's just put this on paper. Let's say that you went ahead with that. You could get Fly, Invisibility, Misty Step, Shield, Spirit Guard.
Is it worth it?
Compare it to a Way of the Four Elements monk. It's a C. It's still a C, but it's actually better than being a level 11 monk. And I think the same is true of the Warlock and the Wizard.
We're giving Sorcerer C.
Yeah.
Not D. Surprised.
Again, tempting, but I just think it speaks to how bad the monk gets and how poorly it scales.
When we do move on to the Warlock, I do think that there's some interesting options here with the Warlock.
Okay. So if you're going to go with a Warlock...
There's some good invocations.
There are some good invocations. You can grab Devil's Sight.
Which, as a Shadow Monk, the most annoying thing is that they didn't give the Shadow Monk a way to see in their own darkness. I think they should.
We could have been a Shadow Sorcerer, Shadow Monk. Yeah, and there's your damage boost right there. Shadow Sorcerer, Shadow Monk.
Yeah.
Right? And we can do the same with... And is that not clearly better than just being a level... You get that at level 8 or 9, depending on when you jump in. Is that not flat out better than the monk at that level?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And you could do the same thing for the Wizard, but again, I don't think it's going to be as effective there.
Well, let's talk about the Warlock for a second. What's the synergy here?
You're getting Devil's Sight and Darkness. You're casting it on yourself as your Shadow Monk. And you're just using that to get advantage on all your attacks.
So, is the Warlock also a C?
I think so, but again, you can do all the same spells that you would have been doing with
the Sorcerer.
They're coming back on a short rest now.
You get less spell slots, but you do get invocations, and I think there's actually a lot of play with a few invocations. Some can even give you at-will spells, like Disguise Self, and things
you can
like that.
Hex. You've got Hex here too, which
Hex.
It's going to be our damage boost. You know, another spell that Warlocks do get as well, which is close to Spirit Guardians, and on the list here is Spirit Shroud.
Yeah.
Right? So that's not bad at all. And again, doesn't matter what your charisma is, you still have to get in the door. You could build around a Hexblade and make your Charisma your best stat. And interestingly enough, your AC is going to suffer for that.
Yeah.
But you know where we can make up for a little bit of it?
Being a turtle.
Mage armor.
Right.
Because we can use mage armor and have we're going to have AC 15.
It's not the best,
and
but
we're gonna have shield.
Yeah.
So mage armor plus shield plus some other defensive features. I actually think that all the spellcasters, 6 levels of monk with any of the spellcasters is stronger than a basic monk. I'm gonna give wizard a C as well, but I want to give them all a C with the asterisk that.
Is wizard like the same vibe? We're taking the same spells.
Yeah. I think the wizard is the less strong of the C's.
Yeah.
Right. I think maybe the warlock is.
I think warlock might be the best of the 3.
I think we could give warlock a B.
Yeah. Okay. Warlock gets a B. Sorcerer gets a C. Wizard gets a C. The middle section of the monk is just really bad. Weak.
It's just really.
You get a lot of really cool stuff in those first 6 levels.
Yeah.
And you get some cool things later on, but there's a lot of dud abilities in the later.
The only thing that I feel bad about missing is evasion, and I'm not heartbroken over missing that.
I mean, if we're a rogue, we might get evasion anyway.
Exactly. And uncanny dodge.
So with all of that in mind, let's take a look at what our community gave the monk. What I think is extremely interesting is that apparently over 50% thought that staying a single-classed monk was the best option. And I'm going to disagree with that. I actually think that there are many of these multi-classes that I would pick over being a single-classed monk.
I agree with you and I disagree with the community. I think that unequivocally, as we talked about with all this discussion with the spellcasters at the end is very relevant. I think that those middle levels of monk really suck. And almost any spellcasting class, like if you really want to look at it, I do actually think that the Artificer and the Bard, maybe we did them dirty by giving them a D tier ranking, and in light of this, they should also be C. I think that the Artificer is weaker than the other options.
Yeah.
I think that
I still think that the Bard's spell list isn't as favorable as the other 3 primaries.
Yes, I agree with you on there.
Besides that, though, I do actually agree with most of what the community has to say here. I agree that they ranked the Ranger, the Rogue, the Fighter, and the Cleric all relatively high, and the Barbarian.
And the Druid, too.
And the Druid.
Yeah.
So all the ones that we really, really liked get pretty favorable numbers here.
Yeah. The Fighter outclassed the Rogue in this respect. I think that the Fighter dip is great. I think the 2-level Fighter dip is great, and I think that you could do Monk, Fighter, Rogue, and have a really strong character. Fighter 2, Rogue 5, Monk 6 would be stronger than a 13th level Monk.
I also am just obsessed with the idea of building this Monk, Druid, Ranger, Fighter.
Yep. Overall, I think that our community rankings of about 51% of people saying staying single class is the way to go with the monk, that's not necessarily terrible advice. Because if you think about it the other way around, most classes don't want to multi-class into monk. But if you're starting out as a monk, get out of there!
I mean, this kind of goes on the track record as us just ripping apart the monk. I do think that the monk is a very fun class to play.
Yeah.
But I will admit that when I was playing a monk from levels 1 to 17, after the first 6 levels, I would read the abilities I would get, and I would say over 50% of the time I would go, oh, that's all I get? Whereas if I was multi-classing into another class, I'd probably get more exciting features as I was leveling up beyond 6.
You feel the power boost, and you feel that damage boost. And like a lot of it comes down to, but with more monk levels, you get a higher martial arts die.
That's a little bit of damage. We can make up that damage by the right multi-class.
Yeah. I personally do think that around when the monk gets about 6 key points, that's the point where you've got enough where you can be doing something with your key on every turn in combat for either one really hard battle or 2 normal battles, and then they're going to come back on a short rest. unless you're doing that whole thing where I've seen a ton of monk players do this, where it's like I flurry of blows and I spend a key point trying to stun someone on everything, and then I used all of my stunning strikes. And incidentally, having 6 key points still lets you try to do that at least once.
I think in the end, the monk actually really benefits from getting things like a fighting style and additional damage boosting spells,
Yep.
Hunter's Mark, or Hex, or anything that can really allow their damage to be buffed up a bit more feels really good when you're making 4 attacks, especially when there's an ability that says each of those attacks gets a bonus. That feels really cool.
Yep.
Tell us about your favorite monk combinations, or how, or what you think of the multi-class combinations we've discussed in the comments below.
The videos that we make on our channel are made possible with the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider becoming a patron of our show by following the links down below.
And if you want to check out our actual play in the worlds of Drakkenheim, be sure to check that out Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more tier ranking content for you to check out right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.